I'm Paul Wiegraf, Director of the Delaware Division of the Arts, and your host for today. This week we are featuring an activity that is sponsored by the Poetry Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts, one of those great examples of how federal funding and state funding for the arts supports very important arts programming for our youth of today and our leaders of the future. That program is Poetry Out Loud, a national poetry recitation program that's been around for 11 years now. We're in the 11th year. And joining me in the studio today is our 2017 Delaware State Champion of Poetry Out Loud, Cecilia Ergueta, a junior at Wilmington Friends School, and our former poet laureate, but also our assistant with the Poetry Out Loud program for a number of years, JoAnn Balingit. Welcome, Cecilia.
Hello.
Great to have you here. And JoAnn.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
So glad you could both join us. We're here in National Poetry Month with the National Poetry Out Loud Finals coming up at the end of April. And Cecilia, you're going to be representing Delaware at the National Finals at the end of April. But what I'd like to do for our listening audience is spend a little bit of time talking about the Poetry Out Loud program, just briefly about its history. And JoAnn, if you could sort of address that, and then we'll turn to Cecilia and hear about her personal experience with the process this year.
Okay, I'd love to do that. Poetry Out Loud, as you said, was hosted or founded by the Poetry Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts in 2005. So it has been a phenomenally successful program. Thousands and thousands of students and teachers and schools across the country in every state, in the Virgin Islands, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico have taken part. And it's a way for students to be exposed to our great literary tradition of poetry and to get back to recitation of poetry, memorizing poems in the classroom. It's a wonderful program, and what happens at the state level, sometimes a number of contests throughout the states, depending on how many people are involved and how big the state is a performance where students recite 3 poems that they've memorized. And so this is bringing the best language, poetic language, and the tradition of poetry not only to students and their teachers, but to an audience in all these venues across the states, in small communities, in big cities, and it culminates every April or May in Washington, D.C., when the 53 state or regional champs compete for the prize and the honor of being the National Poetry Out Loud champion. And that happens to come with a $20,000 scholarship. There are also smaller scholarships at all the state levels. It's just a wonderful program, and I like to say that it amazes me every year to see the wonderful poems performed, and not just that, the maturity and the passion that the high school students, this is a high school program, channel through these works. It's just an amazing program.
Could you speak briefly, JoAnn, about the poetry anthology that the students select from? And then, Cecilia, I'll turn to you and ask you about why you picked the particular poems that you did, and maybe a little later in the show maybe ask you to recite one of those poems.
I'm glad you asked, because this is a wonderful resource. You can go online to www.poetryoutloud.org, and there are all kinds of resources there, teaching lessons, videos, essays, but the highlight of the website is a poetry anthology, over 900 poems. Some of them get retired every year. They get a little too popular, and many get added every year. So there are poems there that are 500 years old by Shakespeare, and poems that were just published maybe last year. So it's a wide and deep selection of American and international poetry. It's a wonderful collection, and you can search it by keyword.
And that's available on Poetry Foundation's site.
Well, it's poetryoutloud.org, and poetryfoundation.org has links to it.
Okay, great. Cecilia, from that anthology, what criteria did you have for selecting poems? I think they're like general categories you need to select from. But then within those categories, how did you pick the ones that you picked? And
yeah, that was definitely a process. There are, I think, you have three poems that you prepare. One of them being under 25 lines, one of them being before the 20th century, written before the 20th century, and the last one is free choice, so that one you can do whatever you like. And that's where actually the website really helped me because, you don't come there with your poems already. I'll do this poem, I'll do that poem. So they have this kind of random generator on the site of just pick a random poem that they have in the anthology, and I just shuffled through that so many times. I looked at hundreds of poems before I decided on the ones that I had, and then looking at whether they match the criteria. And eventually I found my poems, they fit the requirements, and I was good to go.
Now, what sparked your interest in participating in this program in the first place?
Well, I know a lot of schools do it in different ways. I've heard that I'm really impressed by the schools where every single student, is required to participate and compete. But in our school, we have a little kind of student-run club, and it meets at lunches every 7 days. It's called, I think, the Poetry Speaks Club. And the coordinators were encouraging of students not only to share poetry within the club space, but also to participate in Poetry Out Loud. We've only done it, I think, 3 times so far, or twice perhaps. And I just came because I liked poetry, but they were very encouraging for me to give it a go at my school. And I guess that turned out well.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask either one of you, JoAnn, I know you are a poet, a writer of poetry. Cecilia, do you write poetry as well?
I've written poetry, but I wouldn't say I'm a poet.
Okay. JoAnn, how would you characterize the value of reciting poetry? I mean, where does that fit into the full range of what poetry has to offer?
Well, the value, first of all, of reciting poetry is that it is a medium in language, but it's meant to be out loud. It actually is meant to be heard because much of what the poem, quote unquote, means is coming orally, is meant to be heard. Its music carries as much meaning as the form on the page or the words themselves. So to hear a poem out loud and to just have the sound waves sort of hitting your body, to receive it physically, makes a huge difference in how you are understanding, how you are perceiving what the emotion that poem, that poet wanted to convey to you. So a poem is really an emotional delivery package, and to hear it out loud is the best way to get that emotion. And not only that, the students getting a poem by heart, they have that poem forever. They have that language, and it's a way not only to honor our language, but to renew it. For students to be memorizing what has been rendered into the best word in the best words in the best order. For them to have that by heart renews their own imagination and their own use of language. And just getting up in front of people and performing is such a useful activity for confidence and just the pleasure of being able to speak to a group and know that you can do that and move people with a work of art.
Now, this year in Delaware, I believe 20 high schools participated in the semifinals, and then that narrowed down to 13 for the finals. Cecilia, you went through both rounds of that and came out as the state champion. What was your preparation process like to get ready for these 2 rounds of adjudication.
Yeah, I think a lot of people imagine kind of, you sitting down with a poem and kind of working your way through it line by line. But I actually had a very different, unusual process, I would say. I do a lot at school, and I have a lot going on, and so I don't find the time to kind of sit down and go through that laborious process. But I know that for memorizing poetry, it's important to get a kind of daily kind of studying the poem, and so I would do it while I was doing the dishes. And I would be, doing the dishes. I'd have my laptop out, I'd have the poem, and I'd just be running through it line by line by line, and not even worrying about the style at the time. It was just about, if you say something 100 times, you'll know it, and then you can work on what it sounds like, try performing it. So
I think that's really interesting that you memorized your poems while you were doing a physical activity. That fits, that works, because a poem is physical.
Well, it's interesting because I'm a theater person, and I find that learning lines for a musical or a play, it's the same kind of thing. If I'm learning it in the context of physicality, it's much easier to remember what we're doing. Now, before we go to a break, what are some of the criteria, JoAnn, that are used to adjudicate the recitation?
Well, we look at, there's a rubric, and that rubric is also online at poetryoutloud.org. So, first of all, there's an accuracy judge, who is looking at the poem as the performance goes on to make sure there's no words dropped, for example, and there are points there. But we look at the physical presence of, or listen to, I should say, and take in the physical presence of the performer, the articulation of the performer, the sense that the performer understands the poem and is conveying the meaning and the emotional weight that was intended. There's one category which is just called overall. So, it's much like a performance on the stage that people would think of with an actor. There's all of that, presence and articulation and conveying the poem. But there's also a sort of ineffable ability of some performers to put the poem out front so well that the speaker sort of disappears into the poem. So I would say becomes a vessel for the poem, and Cecilia did that so well at the finals.
Question: how can you judge poetry recitation? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe poetry was one of the Olympic events in the ancient Greek Olympics.
It was. That's where the laurel wreath came from for Poet Laureate.
If you would, I would love to have you share one of your poems with our listening audience. But first, let me remind our listeners that you are tuned into Delaware State of the Arts here on News Radio 1450 WILM and 1410 WDOV. Our guests in the studio today are the 2017 Delaware Poetry Out Loud champions, Cecilia Ergueta from Wilmington Friends School, and JoAnn Balingit, our Poetry Out Loud coordinator here in Delaware and former state poet laureate. Cecilia, JoAnn and I were talking. I hope you're okay with doing the True Blue American. I'm going to ask JoAnn to just give a little bit of background briefly about Delmore Schwartz, the poet, and then ask you to do the recitation.
Yes, Delmore Schwartz was an American poet born in 1913 in Brooklyn, and he died at age 51 in New York, much revered by his contemporaries, by poets, a great American poet, and I think one of his most eloquent fans is the rock musician Lou Reed, who was his student at Syracuse University. So you can listen to a couple of songs, My House, which is on the album Blue Mask, or European Sun, or read essays by Lou Reed about his beloved teacher, Delmore Schwartz.
Okay, Cecilia, why don't you introduce this the way you would as though you're coming up to the microphone at the competition?
Sure. The True Blue American by Delmore Schwartz. Jeremiah Dixon was a true blue American. for he was a little boy who understood America, for he felt that he must think about everything, because that's all there is to think about. Knowing immediately the intimacy of truth and comedy, knowing intuitively how a sense of humor was a necessity for one and for all who live in America. Thus, natively and naturally, when, on an April Sunday in an ice cream parlor, Jeremiah was requested to choose between a chocolate sundae and a banana split, he answered unhesitatingly, having no need to think of it. Being a true blue American, determined to continue as he began, rejecting the either-or of Kierkegaard and many another European, refusing to accept alternatives, refusing to believe the choice of between, rejecting selection, denying dilemma, electing absolute affirmation, knowing in his breast the infinite and the gold of the endless frontier, the deathless West. Both. I will have them both, declared this true blue American in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in an ice cream parlor, instructed by the great department stores, by the 5 and 10, taught by Christmas, by the circus, by the vulgarity and grandeur of Niagara Falls and the Grand Canyon, tutored by the grandeur, vulgarity, and infinite appetite, gratified and shining in the darkness of the light on Saturdays, at the double bills of the moon pictures, the consummation of the advertisement, of the imagination, of the light, which is, as it was, the infinite belief in infinite hope of Columbus, Barnum, Edison, and Jeremiah Dixon.
Thank you. I would love to have there be more dead air to just let that settle, but we're on the radio, so I can't do that. Wonderful job. Tell me, what prompted you to select that particular poem?
Well, I actually started out, I had one poem in mind, originally set out, and it was one of the ones that I've done. What that I do actually is The Nail by C.K. Williams, and it's a poem about torture, and it's very, very dark, and so I thought, well, I just have to have something that balances out this extraordinary darkness. So I wanted something fun, something light, and this one, it's satirical, so it's not, it's not kind of the brightest one, but it is funny and it is light, and so I really appreciated that, and I like that there was some substance to it too. I think it's definitely a commentary on American culture, and I think that's fun to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the process of learning the poems and then hearing other students recite these poems at both the semifinals and the finals, did you learn anything from hearing others recite that has kind of informed what you're doing as you move through the process and now head on to Washington?
That's an interesting question. I did notice that I think I unknowingly did a good job with my range of poetry. I think some students, they're fantastic, but they chose poems that were very similar, and so they weren't able to show their kind of range of ability. So I think I'm going to try to really emphasize that coming up, of how I can do a very dark poem, a very serious poem, and then a kind of a lighter one. Other than that...
Yeah, I think Cecilia scored really strong marks for her choice of poems, and that's a really important strategy too. What poems you choose, and you're very perceptive. If a student does poems that are all of similar tone, they can't show their breadth. Right.
We have about 2 minutes left, so in those 2 minutes, what are some of the activities that you're going to be involved in the upcoming weeks related to your state championship?
Yeah, we have Delaware Arts Advocacy Day, which I believe is on May 4th. There will be no recitations, and also various other guest speakers. So that'll be a lot of fun. And then, of course...
And that's down in Dover, I believe, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Then, of course, on April 25th and April 26th is the actual event, the National Poetry Competition, where there'll be, I guess, 51 other students.
52 others,
52 other students competing for the prize. And that's going to be a lot of fun.
That's 50 states and 2 U.S. territories, I believe, right?
And Washington, D.C.
And D.C., right? D.C. and, one other, right? Okay, great. So are you excited about that?
I am. It's on my birthday.
Oh, I'm going to tell them.
And I believe the first day, it's the preliminary rounds, and then the finalists go on to the second day.
Delaware will come in the morning. There's 3 regional group competitions. So the first is at 9 a.m. and Delaware is grouped in that group at 9 a.m. and all of this streams live. If you go to the National Endowment for the Arts and search Poetry Out Loud, when we're coming up to April 25th, you can log in and watch it happening from anywhere.
Now, you've been before, JoAnn. Any quick insights? We've got about 40 seconds left.
Have fun and get to know all the fellow contestants. It will be so amazing.
Oh, that will.
Yeah. And you get to go down free, Cecilia, with an adult chaperone. And you've already gotten a small stipend, I believe, for the state championship. And your school has gotten $500, or will be getting $500 for poetry materials. And if you win at the national level, you'll be getting considerably more in scholarships. So that's a wonderful opportunity. Our guests in the studio today have been Cecilia Ergueta, the 2017 Delaware Poetry Out Loud champion, who will be heading down to Washington, D.C. on April 25th and 26th for the national competition. Also in the studio with us is JoAnn Balingit, Poetry Out Loud coordinator and former state poet laureate. Thanks both for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
Thank you.